conversation with Dr. Suad Abdul Kabir and Zaheer Ali talking about Malcolm X as a Muslim, which is really important because with all the quotes and everything that you can pull from Malcolm X and all the different aspects of who he was, we can get excited about that, and we should be excited about that. But understanding him as a Muslim is important, and that's why this conversation is here. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. Assalamu. Thank you so much, Adisa and Rashida. And assalamu Zaheer. Oh, I see you got a Malcolm background too. All right.
I mean, I don't have like y'all don't want to know. It's like a messy background, but it's all good in the spirit of the yeah.
So thanks. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Black Legacies, Black Futures in honor of Malcolm X. I am Dr. Saad, Senior Editor at Sapelo, and we're joined today with our dear brother, OG squad member, Zaheer Ali. For nearly 2 decades, oral historian Zaheer Ali has listened to, amplified, and preserved the stories of marginalized voices. His work has informed the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Malcolm X. He spawned a viral video on the Bean Pie, and also he has inspired a critically acclaimed art collection, Installation, and he is currently senior editor at the Pillars Fund. And so we invited Zaheer, who is, Zaheer is one of these people that if I need to know anything about anything, I ask Zaheer. Okay.
You're too kind.
And particularly around Malcolm X. And so one of the things, so the first question I have for you is that, as Rashida mentioned, when we first started Sapelo, one of the first things we did these posts on Malcolm. And one of the first posts was this exhibition called Refracting Light, where we asked Black Muslims to sort of reflect on Malcolm in audio and then send us their favorite picture of him. And so one of those folks who's an entrepreneur and artist, Camilla Schwabe, she sent this really creative rendition, right, of her photo of Malcolm. Malcolm, he's praying. He's making salah. I think we're going to show the photo now just so people have a reference to it. And so I feel like this photo is really important. It's really iconic, but not typical of the kind of visuals we see, right, about Malcolm. And so I was wondering if you might tell us a bit about this image itself and maybe why it's not used as often.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting image. I felt the same way when I first saw this picture, because it's so unusual. This is a picture, for people who aren't familiar, of Malcolm in the standing posture of Salat. Salat as Muslims around the world of the global super tradition of Islam understand it to be. And the reason why this is so important is that for many years, scholars have wondered at what point does Malcolm engage Islam as many of us kind of are familiar with it. And this photograph, I believe, from my research, is dated to 1963. It could be late 63, it could be early 64. The photograph, I think just thinking about the photograph, this is not a, kind of candid documentary shot. It's clear that this is not like somebody set their cell phone up to take a self-timed selfie. Malcolm has a photographer standing in front of him to take this photograph, which says something about the intentionality of what Malcolm had in mind in ensuring that this particular kind of photograph would be taken, which tells us that he really wanted people to see him in this prayer posture. And this is really important for when we are trying to understand Malcolm as a Muslim. And this is a question or an issue that I think is something for us to really be clear about in centering Malcolm in the context of Islam and Islam in America. But I want to go even further and say centering Malcolm as a Black Muslim. Not just as a Muslim. And I know that people are going to be like, why you always got to bring in the Black stuff? I know none of the Sapelo family don't feel that way, but I think it's important for us when we look at this picture, so this is, if this picture is in 1963, then he's still in the Nation of Islam, right? Like that raises a lot of questions about how people have understood the Nation of Islam and its relationship to, you know, other traditions or practices within Islam. And so, you know, for me, Malcolm was always a Muslim, right? You know, I proceed from the Quranic verse in chapter 23, the believers, that says, you know, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Then we made the sperm into a cloud of congealed blood. Then of that cloud, we made a fetus. Then we made out of that lump bones and clothed the bones with flesh. Then we developed out of it another creature. So blessed be Allah, the best to create. And I always connect this with Malcolm's own words in the autobiography of Malcolm X. My whole life has been a chronology of changes, right? So who would step to, or not step to, but who would look at a clot and say it's not Muslim? Who would look at a fetus and say it's not Muslim? Who are we to look at any individual in their evolutionary development, in their evolution of chronological changes, and say and freeze them at any one point in time and say that is not Muslim? Because we are not the director, we are not the sustainer, we are not the nourisher, we are not the one that brings people into stage after stage of development. That is Allah and Allah alone. So I always proceed from that point. But even if we want to deal with historically, Malcolm, you know, even while he was in prison, he encountered the first person to visit him who was Muslim was this man named Abdul Hamid, who was an Ahmadiyya Muslim in the Boston area. And in 1949, Malcolm was writing poetry that had lines like music without the musician is like life without Allah, right? Wow. And that poem was quoted by Malcolm Jarvis, who was his, you know, I don't want to say cellmate, but who was also in prison with him. Right. And they sent that letter to Abdul Hamid. So Malcolm in 1949 was already trying to make sense of the relationship between creation and creator, right? We know in 1950, after Malcolm encountered the teachings of the Nation of Islam, it began his prison activism for religious rights for incarcerated people. In 1950, the Boston Herald and the Springfield Union had articles about this with headlines like local criminals in prison claim Muslim faith now. They seek, you know, they're growing beards. They seek cells that face Mecca. They want an altered diet that has no pork. So, you know, I think that a lot of times we want to like demarcate these parts in Malcolm's life. Right. Yeah. It's just like, this is, and it's usually around the Malcolm's Hajj, right? So for some people, Malcolm isn't Muslim until 1964, which is like mind-blowing to me, right? Because if that's what you want to do, you have cut yourself off from a whole decade plus of deep activism.
And why is that though? Like, so why, so okay, so you're saying, so you're making this point, right? That sort of Malcolm as a Muslim. And so we have this picture when he's still a Nation of Islam, right? And this sort of unorthodox, right? Sort of Muslim practice, right? He's still, and he's making Salah in a very orthodox way, right? And so that troubles some of that history. But why is it, do you think, that, so he makes Hajj and then all of a sudden, like now he's a Muslim?
Because I think people treat his letter from Hajj like the I Have a Dream speech of Martin King as a kind of, you know, get out of jail free card for white people in America, as though he is talking about, and you know, and Malcolm, in fact, the video clip that y'all played earlier, he's like, that was my individual experience. Right. But I'm not stupid to think that my individual experience disconnects me from the linked fate of Black people in America under systemic oppression, right? And so his letter, even if you read his letter with all of its like poetry, you see that he puts like white in quotes, and he talks about removing the whiteness of their minds, of their attitudes, of their beliefs. So he still sees something problematic in whiteness, right? He is understanding that that whiteness as a socially constructed identity is deeply, deeply problematic. And is not really compatible with Islam, right? So if we really want to dig into that letter from Hajj, we are looking at a letter that is asking white people, especially, to engage in what some like left progressives talk about as race treason, right? Like you have to betray the imperatives of whiteness in America, in order to be part of a human family, right? Like it's the whiteness in America does not, it inhibits participation in human family. I'm not saying white people, let me be very clear. I'm using the language of white in quotes as Malcolm used it, that is, and so that kind of reading, puts that is possible if you put the letter from Mecca or the letter from Hajj, because he was in Jeddah actually when he wrote it, but the letter from Hajj in the context of his broader history, which he never deviated from, right? For Malcolm, being a Muslim was always being Black. It was always being anti-racist. It was always understanding white supremacy as a form of shirk, right? Understanding it as a form of idolatry that needed to be destroyed. And so that, I think, is a work that a lot of people may not want to do, right? Like they want to have like I said, an I Have a Dream version of Malcolm,
Yes, I wonder if it's sort of like, so on one hand, you're saying that folks are, so the kind of Malcolm made Hajj now became Muslim, absolves whiteness or absolves white people from dealing with whiteness. But I wonder, does it also absolve people from dealing with Blackness too?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, there's this exchange that happens with Malcolm, and I think the magazine is Al Muslimun. It's a Switzerland-based, from the Islamic Center in Switzerland, which was, I think, led by Tariq Ramadan's father, Saeed Ramadan. And they had sent him a list of questions, and he actually wrote out the answers in the final week of his life and sent it back to them. And he's very clear that he is not going to abandon his commitment to Black people, because they don't understand with this, kind of embrace they interpret as, quote unquote, Orthodox Islam. Why are you still talking about race? And he's being very clear that he has to. And I think that for a lot of Muslims who celebrate Malcolm, well, let me just say this. So Malcolm's time in the Nation of Islam is a challenge for a lot of Muslims who are not in the Nation of Islam. It's probably a challenge for Muslims who are in the Nation of Islam, seeing how that story went. But it's a challenge because of these questions of practice and faith that are different from how people understand the tradition of Islam, right? The quote unquote heterodoxy. I don't like using doxies, right? But for people to understand, it wasn't what we consider Sunni Islam, right? And so people engage Malcolm in a narcissistic way. They only want to deal with the Malcolm they can see themselves in, right? And so for a lot of people, they're like, I only see myself in the post-Meccan Malcolm. Well, if that's all you see yourself, that's sad, right? Because Malcolm visited the Middle East and in 1959. He forged relationships in 1959 that he would later revisit in 1964 after leaving the Nation of Islam. So that even if you don't want to go back to 1949 when he was an incarcerated person, you can still look at the 1950s when Malcolm is fashioning these important and forming these important relationships with Muslims and really engaging Islam in a dialogic way, right? Like as something that he understands himself to be. And so I think in that you find, the roots of I think the power of Islam in America to, like I said, challenge the idolatry and shirk of white supremacy. You find the power of Islam in America to speak to as a kind of public moral voice to to racial inequity and injustice, to police brutality, to incarceration, to like all of the ills that were evident in American society, as Malcolm as a self-identified Muslim
Right.
was speaking to that throughout his entire career.
Yeah.
And the ways that he spoke to that, there is nothing about the ways that he analyzed those things as a Muslim that are not compatible with our Islam, right? And so that's why I think it's important for us to engage that history.
No, thank you. And I got one last question before we let you go. So our theme is Black Legacies, Black Futures, right? And so one of the things that I've heard members of Malcolm's family sort of kind of call out the Muslim community in the United States, saying you should claim him, right? And I'm wondering if you might speak to that, like why are we claiming him? Are we not claiming him? And how would our future, right? How would Black futures be different, right? If we claimed Malcolm in all this complexity, right? That
yeah. I think we by claiming Malcolm, we access his history as a resource in terms of all of this political knowledge and analysis. We access his history as a critical tool with which to analyze our present condition. And we access his history as a living practice with which to move forward. I think we have to claim all of Malcolm. So the picture we started with was Malcolm in prayer. And that is Malcolm, that is a Muslim picture of Malcolm as much as it's a Black picture of Malcolm, right? And I look at this picture of Malcolm at a rally. And to me, that is a picture that is as much Malcolm as a Muslim as is Malcolm as a Black activist. And I think we need to not try to disentangle Blackness and Islam. And I think if we claim Malcolm and claim all of Malcolm, that helps us understand that intricate relationship between the best of the Black progressive tradition and the best of the progressive. And I say progressive meaning the kind of Islam that is going to counter the hegemonic practices of white supremacy and racism in America.
Right. Well, thank you. Wow, that was really powerful.